So my name is Boyung Lee. I am a vice chair of this organization, who is also program chair elect. So that means I'm responsible for next year's program. So it is my honor to moderate this session. So, we have been hearing about Hanan from the beginning of this conference, that Dr. Hanan Alexander, who had a major health issue that addressed a week or so ago with a triple bypass, is at home, and he is on his way to recovery. But he wrote his paper, and he asked one of his dearest colleagues and friends, whom he invited to present at REA this year, and read his paper. So Hanan's paper will be read by Dr. Marc Silverman, who was a member of the Melton Center for Jewish Education academic faculty in the School of Education of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem for the last 45 years. Among his many accomplishments, and he has published books both in Hebrew and English, particularly on Janusz Korczak's educational philosophy and pedagogy. So without the presence of Hanan, we sort of organized ourselves that Dr. Silverman will read Dr. Alexander's paper, and then I will invite you to talk to your neighbor about what did you hear? What did you hear? And then help each other to process what you heard, so that you make sure that you heard different things, but put together that you heard Dr. Alexander's paper. And then after that, Dr. HyeRan Kim-Cragg, who holds the Timothy Eaton Memorial Professorship in Preaching at Emmanuel College in the University of Toronto in town. Previously, she held the Lydia Grouch Chair of Pastoral Studies at St. Andrew's College in Saskatchewan. And so she is also standing chair of the Standing Committee on Religious Education and Faith Communities and board member. So she will respond to Hanan's paper for about 10 minutes with some discussion questions. So after her response, we will also engage with one another with the questions posed by her, and then your communal processing of Hanan's paper. And after that, we will come back, and then we will hear the second response by Dr. Hosffman Ospino, who is Associate Professor of Hispanic Ministry and Religious Education at Boston College, who is also Chair of a Proposals Selection Committee of the REA, and who is REA board member. So Dr. Hosffman will do his response, and then I will invite you to do another round of reflection on his response. And then we thought, maybe after that, we will have some general conversations. And, we cannot answer for Hanan, but I think we can process themes provoked by him together as a body. So without due, I introduce and also invite Dr. Silverman to read Dr. Hanan Alexander's paper that is titled Peaceful Coexistence Through Pedagogies of the Sacred of Difference and of Hope.
I feel very honored to read Hanan's paper, and I'll try to do my best. One of the great accomplishments, that wasn't in the paper. Now I'm beginning the paper, okay? One of the great accomplishments of modernity has been the establishment of societies in which people can live together with others whose ways of life are different than their own. Unfortunately, this achievement is currently threatened by rising forms of populism on the right and the left of the political and religious spectrums that are challenging the idea that peaceful coexistence across deep difference is a valuable social ideal. A growing chasm exists in the public deliberations of democracies around the world today, in which people of diverse religious and spiritual persuasions find it increasingly difficult to communicate across difference in order to live together in a common civil society. These differences are often tied to political ideology, ethical orientation, moral proclivity, cultural identity, nationality, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and more. Consequently, extreme positions on the right and the left of the political and religious spectrums have come increasingly to dominate the public square which challenge peaceful coexistence across difference. In this talk, I argue that the time has come to take the public square back from these extremes in diverse democratic societies by offering an alternative account of how we might live together in peaceful coexistence and a concomitant pedagogy to prepare youngsters to do so. After a brief review of the role of diversity in pre-modern social and political theory, I turn to the two revolutions of modernity that laid the foundation for contemporary thinking on the topic. I argue that the most influential trends in education for religious and spiritual affiliation that emerged from these modern revolutions have contributed to this chasm. One follows the political liberalism and educational thought of American philosophers John Rawls and John Dewey. The other, the cosmopolitan multiculturalism of German critical theorist Jürgen Habermas and of Brazilian critical pedagogue Paulo Freire. I then consider an alternative to these accounts of the public square, which requires a recovery of humanism grounded in the diversity liberalism of Isaiah Berlin and the diversity theology of Jonathan Sachs and Emmanuel Levinas. The essay concludes with reference to some educational consequences of this analysis that draws on my own contribution to educational philosophy called Pedagogy of the Sacred and of Difference. During pre-modern times, Western politics was dominated by ancient Greek philosophy, according to which a virtuous society should serve a uniform vision of the good life. Plato proposed a hierarchical version of such a society, according to which each would receive resources and power according to his or her perceived capacity to engage in a form of dialectical reasoning that would liberate from false beliefs and lead to a proper understanding of the idea of justice. Such a society would be governed by philosophers, not monarchs, oligarchs, or democratic citizens, who are capable of comprehending this idea and of implementing it in practice. By way of contrast, Aristotle thought that a virtuous society should serve its citizens not the idea of justice, by enabling them to flourish. Although human flourishing may be fostered in different ways by distinct political communities that embody diverse cultural traditions, to do so, these communities must embrace the underlying rationality of reality itself. Aristotle referred to this underlying rationality as God, who brought the universe into being, and whose comprehension and contemplation constitute the ultimate purpose of human existence. Within medieval scholastic philosophy, this proto-pluralistic outlook enabled the possibility of conversation across different communities, each organized around its respective religious tradition, provided that each tradition sought reconciliation between faith as revealed in its sacred texts and human reason as conceived by pagan philosophy. To live in such a community, however, required adherence to a uniform account of what one should believe and how one should behave that was determined heteronomously by local religious and political authorities, not autonomously by oneself. This all changed with the two revolutions of modernity, Enlightenment and Emancipation. The Enlightenment was a 16th and 17th century European intellectual movement that challenged transcendental assumptions of Platonic and Aristotelian rationality by subjecting them to a rigorous form of empirical skepticism. This put all beliefs against an account of objective reality outside of human consciousness, uncomfortable with Plato's world of ideal essence and Aristotle's teleological theology, and begins and ends with an original cause. For example, in a doctrine now known as empiricism, 16th century British philosopher John Locke maintained that people are born without innate ideas. Knowledge is determined by experience alone, derived from sense perception. In a state of nature, therefore, prior to experiencing the world, people are fundamentally equal and should be entitled to restrict one another's life and property only following a mutually agreed upon social contract. When 17, excuse me, when 17th century Scottish philosopher David Hume subjected the assumption of this kind of skepticism to the same sort of doubts that empiricism used to challenge pre-modern rationalism, 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant responded. He proposed that understanding is only possible because of certain rational capacities with which human beings are endowed prior to ever experiencing the world, and that a just society should be governed by the equal and autonomous exercise of these very rational capacities by its citizens, not by higher authorities. These Enlightenment ideas gave rise to a series of political revolutions in the 18th and 19th centuries, known collectively as emancipation. They were mostly grounded in a liberal democratic account of justice that followed the political theories of Locke and Kant. According to this account, the right of autonomous citizens to choose ways of life for themselves based on their own rational capacities should take precedence over any conception of the good life that may be promoted by one group or another, whether based on religious faith, political ideology, ethical tradition, ethnic affiliation, or some other amalgamations of heteronomous ideals, attitudes, and customs. In this view, it is the obligation of any moral form of government to protect this fundamental right to choose a way of life. This value became known as liberal toleration or pluralism, and it has been subjected to two sorts of criticism, one pertaining to Locke and the other to Kant. The difficulty with Locke's position is that an actual social contract would only commit those who gave their assent to the agreement in real time. This is where an implied contract was thought to be relevant. One's consent to the original agreement could be inferred, it was thought, from one's willingness to enjoy the benefits that accrue from living in a society so founded. But this, of course, does not follow. The fact that one resides in a society and benefits from its organization does not imply that one would agree to the terms and conditions contained in its founding documents. Hence, the fact that one assents to them may be less voluntary than Locke supposed. The difficulty with Kant's position was noted by the 19th century German counter-Enlightenment philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Contra Kant, Hegel held that reason is not the a priori lens through which people interpret the world outside of consciousness. Rather, it is acquired throughout history by way of a posteriori experience itself within the world outside of consciousness. Reason progresses, according to this view, by means of a dialectical process inspired by Plato but inserted into history by Hegel. Each generation criticizes the ideas of its immediate ancestors to liberate those ideas and their proponents from error until absolute freedom is achieved first by a single nation or culture, and eventually by all of humanity. Protecting the right of autonomous individuals to choose their way of life by placing political authority in their hands may prove to be highly problematic, therefore. These individuals may not share a common account of reason, or their respective ways of reasoning may turn out to be flawed from one viewpoint or another. Extreme interpretations of this Hegelian view on both the right and the left of the political spectrum may well provide the basis for much of the populism that is challenging pluralism today. But this claim alone does not address the conceptual difficulty that arises from Hegel's critique of Kant. Rawls and Habermas are perhaps the two most influential recent philosophers of diversity to address these difficulties with the liberal politics of Locke and Kant. However, the response of Rawls and Habermas to Locke and Kant have also proven to be problematic. This is one of the main reasons I contend why the great pluralistic achievement of modernity is currently under assault. Rawls responded to difficulties with Locke's social contract by way of an agreement that would be accepted under certain hypothetical conditions. He called this the veil of ignorance. According to this idea, people would agree to two principles of justice were they to be unaware of the position they would hold in a society governed by them. The first of these is procedural justice. This principle would guarantee that the rules and institutions of a society would be so constructed as to be administered fairly without reference to irrelevant social, economic, gendered, ethnic, racial, or other considerations. The second of these is distributive justice. It would ensure that all things being equal, resources would be allocated so as to protect the interest of the weakest elements in society. However, when Rawls came to realize that these two principles can themselves be construed as a comprehensive concept of the good, he proposed a more limited theory, which he called political liberalism. According to this alternative, accepting certain burdens of judgment would lead citizens to seek principles of justice compatible with every reasonable person's conception of the good. He called this public reason, which constitutes the basis of an overlapping consensus to direct the legitimate exercise of political power. Habermas, on the other hand, sought to revive a version of Kantian rationality by reconsidering certain left-leaning interpretations of Hegel. In contrast to Hegel's view, that history progresses by way of a dialectical conversation across. Karl Marx held that the true engine of human progress entails overcoming current social conflicts between those who possess economic resources and the means to produce them and those who do not. Procedural justice cannot be guaranteed in this view unless economic resources are distributed equitably. Otherwise, those with more money or with greater capacity to make money will always be able to exercise undue influence on the exercise of rules and regulations. To this claim, neo-Marxists such as Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno added that the pursuit of social progress must be concerned with the equitable distribution of cultural, not only economic power. Known also as critical theorists, they proposed what has become known as a multicultural society in which cultural as well as economic resources are distributed equitably. In keeping with this view, Habermas argued that such society should base political decisions on a form of non-discriminatory discourse akin to Kantian rationality, only grounded in intersubjective agreement rather than the a priori conditions of individual cognition. The difficulty with Rawls' position lies in requiring citizens to embrace a particular understanding of pluralism, according to which people would be permitted to participate in public deliberation only by stating their beliefs in terms that could be acceptable to all. But this violates the boundaries of pluralism itself. Many beliefs, especially those associated with religious faith, cannot be formulated in terms of this sort of reasonableness without losing something of their very essence. To condition participation in civic discourse on embracing this formulation of public reason could well require leaving one's most cherished beliefs at the door. The difficulty with Habermas's view lies in his assumption that a free intersubjective consensus is possible, which considers the total equalization of power to be a worthwhile end. But this may not be so. Those who do not believe in unqualified equity would inevitably be excluded from such a consensus and thus denied it access to power. If people of this kind agree to such a consensus, in all likelihood they would only do so perfunctorily because they would not want to be left without resources. Admission to the public domain, in this view, is predicated on accepting what some would consider to be a rather extreme account of distributive justice, whether or not one would otherwise want to do so. And this undermines diversity no less than Rawls' account of public reason. Perhaps the most influential educational theories associated with the American liberalism and the cosmopolitan multiculturalism can be found in the writings of John Dewey and Paulo Freire. Dewey argued that democratic education should prepare autonomous youngsters to solve problems encountered in experience by drawing on concepts and skills contained in the cultural heritages passed on, if selectively by previous generations. Freire, on the other hand, suggested what he called a critical pedagogy that poses problems to be addressed by groups of students who are encouraged to call upon their own particular backgrounds to contribute to a collective consensus. Although each of these educational theories offers a hope of individual and collective liberation from the bonds of the past and current limitations, illusions, and oppressions, each restricts the possibility of such hope by homogenizing the many sorts of differences that need to be acknowledged, accepted, and engaged in order to achieve the sort of peaceful coexistence that can lend meaning to such aspirations. The societies generated by these political and educational theories condition equal treatment on leaving difference at the door of the public domain. Hence, many religious, cultural, and political worldviews often feel excluded from the public sphere in societies influenced by these views because they are thought to be too divisive, distinctive, and dominating. I would suggest that one of the reasons for the rise of various forms of political polarization and populism across the world today, on both the right and on the left, has to do with a pushback against these versions of liberalism, both political and multicultural, by those who feel as though their voices have been excluded from the public sphere, which turns out to be less tolerant of diversity than they purport to be. Rather than promoting universal toleration of difference, this sort of exclusionism has tended to isolate intolerant and hateful voices on the fringes of diverse societies, with few opportunities for tempering dialogue with alternative or opposing views that can moderate extremes. When these voices do finally make their way into the public domain, they can sometimes be especially harsh and discordant, even violent. This is to explain, not justify, these sorts of bigotries and prejudices, at least in part, and to suggest the need for an alternative political theory on which to ground the celebration of diversity and accompanying pedagogies to prepare youngsters to live in a society envisaged by such a theory. A way out of the morass generated by this growing chasm among diverse religious, spiritual, cultural, political, and other orientations can be found in a renewed commitment to our common humanity, conceived in terms of the uniqueness, not uniformity, of each individual person. I have called this a recovery of humanism, and grounded my own commitment to such a recovery in the value pluralism of the 20th century British philosopher Isaiah Berlin, and in the theology of difference of the Hebrew Bible as read by Jewish philosophers Jonathan Sacks and Emmanuel Levinas. Berlin viewed the human experience as comprised of multiple distinct and often incommensurable cultures and traditions, and the task of politics to discover a modus vivendi for peaceful coexistence across difference through dialogue. This political theory has sometimes been called diversity liberalism, as opposed to political or multicultural liberalism. According to Sacks, the distinctiveness of each person's experience of the world follows from the idea that people are created in image of the divine. This means that each person is different, not the same, special, singular, in a word, holy, like God, the ultimate model of holiness. These unique persons call out to us, following Levinas, in all of their individuality, and each is obliged to respond by receiving the other in a non-reciprocal relation of responsibility, with the words of the Hebrew prophets, Hineni, here I am to serve. In contrast to Dewey and Frere, I have argued that genuine hope for peaceful coexistence is to be sought in three educational consequences of the account of diversity advocated by Berlin, Sacks, and Levinas. I call them pedagogy of the sacred, intelligent spirituality, and pedagogy of difference. Pedagogy of the sacred entails initiation into a particular tradition or worldview to become an insider, so to say. But not just any perspective will suffice for living together in a diverse society. The particular ways of life into which people should be initiated for this purpose must be prepared to dialogue alternative, even opposing orientations. I have called viewpoints that are prepared to engage in this way intelligent spiritualities. Engaging alternatives involves teaching and learning about or from them as an outsider, as it were, by way of phenomenology, sociology, history, politics, philosophy, theology, or some other relevant academic discipline, or to consider insights that they may offer non-believers. Pedagogy of the sacred is concerned with initiation in a worldview that can form the basis of one's primary identity, while at the same time imparting the values and capabilities needed to engage alternative perspectives in dialogue. This entails the acquisition of intelligent ideals thought to be sacred through instruction in a comprehensive vision of how to live a good life, its language and history, stories, songs and dances, customs and ceremonies, and beliefs, values, and practices. Clearly, faith traditions constitute one important option for such an identity-shaping worldview, but non-religious ethical orientations can also serve this role. It is from this sanctified perspective that a person acquires the normative standards against which to judge beliefs, behaviors, and values on the basis of which one can participate in deliberation and debate in the public square. I call these sorts of views intelligent spirituality. They outline the contours of curriculum in worldviews suitable for such a pedagogy by suggesting that lives worth living can be discovered through identifying with learning communities devoted to visions of a higher good. Learning here is meant to convey that a community is prepared to adjust beliefs and customs according to engagement with alternative views and changing circumstances, and higher is used rather than highest to suggest that the ideals in question are subject to revision on the basis of that which is learned from experience. Although higher goods that address the whole of one's life offer comprehensive vision of how one should live, they are also dynamic and evolving, not dogmatic and resistant to change. However, how is it possible to challenge sacred perspectives of this kind, which are grounded in particular traditions, given that there is no objective or intersubjective view upon which to base this sort of inquiry? One answer involves learning to view one orientation from the perspective of another. This is where pedagogy of difference comes into play, which involves instruction from or about worldviews other than one's own. It presupposes that an education worthy of the name must not only initiate into a concept of the sacred, according to one tradition or another, but also offer exposure to alternative perspectives. One learns to critique, not only according to the internal standards of traditions to which one is heir or with which one has chosen to affiliate, but also according to the criteria of at least one alternative, if not more. Dialogue across difference is integral to a pedagogy of this kind, which generates the possibility of education in a critical viewpoint. Each orientation is strengthened, not weakened, in this sort of critical dialogue through a process of mutual learning. The point of such engagement is the same both faith-based and common schools, the one serving a single religious community and the other a community of communities that encompasses multiple approaches to belief and unbelief. It is to empower students with an inquisitive attitude toward the worldview to which they are here, or with which they choose to affiliate, and to promote respect for perspectives deeply different from their own. This is accomplished by subjecting all perspectives to critical scrutiny, both from within and without, in ways that are appropriate to the educational setting in question. This dialogical pedagogy proposes a faith school curriculum that facilitates moral agency and peaceful coexistence in the democratic public square through interchange among alternative worldviews and a common school curriculum that teaches about and occasionally from, but not in a religion or worldview. Taking back the public square requires a recovery of humanism that is grounded in the fundamental diversity, not uniformity, of human experience, and a concomitant innovative pedagogy that prepares students both to embrace the ways in which they are different from others and to engage and respect the ways others may be different from them. Teaching this concept of humanity requires cultivating a robust sense of self, rooted in a tradition that is at once capable of inspiring such a sense of obligation towards others, yet also able to engage others whose sources of inspiration and obligation may be very different than our own. Herein lies the possibility of genuine hope for recovery from our current morass.
Thank you. Those of you who came in late, those of you who haven't met Dr. Hanan Alexander, please know that this is read by Dr. Marc Silverman, the paper written by Dr. Hanan Alexander. Since, as I said in the beginning, we don't have an author of the paper, so it's not fair for Dr. Silverman to answer. So therefore, I'm inviting you to turn to your neighbor and process together. So what are a couple of points that Dr. Hanan Alexander is proposing here as an alternative after giving that long overview of his assessment of diversity and coexistence. So Dr. Alexander, even before he wrote this paper, he invited two colleagues whose opinions may not be the same as his. So he invited intentionally to bring different perspectives to his point. So what we just processed that Dr. Hosffman, Ospino will go first, and then Dr. HyeRan Kim-Cragg follow him, and will pose two questions that they agreed for us to think about. So based on what you heard, the paper read by Dr. Silverman, and hear two responses, and then think about whether their response address some of your questions. And then after two responses with the questions, we will engage further.
Good afternoon. It is an honor to offer this brief response to Professor Hanan Alexander's presidential address during this 2019 Religious Education Association meeting on the theme, Peaceful Coexistence Through Pedagogies of the Sacred, of Difference and of Hope. Those are special effects that I hired. I hired them, so it's just true. I'm profoundly grateful to him for the invitation to wrestle with some of his thoughts and share a few insights with you, colleagues and friends attending this meeting. Anyone familiar with Professor Alexander's writings on philosophy of religious education will promptly recognize in today's address some of his central tenets of his lifelong work. A sincere concern for providing a vision for religious education that engages the public square in democratic societies with their complexities, possibilities, and contradictions lies at the heart of his reflection. In his address today, read by Professor Marc Silverman, Dr. Hanan walks us in broad strokes through core ideas and recognized dominant names that have defined political scientific discourse in the Western world. Professor Alexander artfully introduces us to Plato and Aristotle's musings about the principles they thought should ground the ideal society and who should be at its helm. He names the revolutionary proposals of John Locke and Immanuel Kant on the role of the individual vis-a-vis the construction of the modern social body. Every revolution has supporters and detractors, of course. And Professor Alexander does a good job highlighting the critiques that George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and later Jürgen Habermas and John Rawls make regarding the limitations of the Enlightenment and Emancipation movements. Turning to emerging pedagogical insights that simultaneously accompany and critique modern ideas of democratic liberalism and cosmopolitan multiculturalism, he introduces us to John Dewey and Paulo Freire. Toward the end of his address, aiming to engage the question of difference in the context of the modern liberal society, Professor Alexander draws from the work of philosophers Isaiah Berlin, Jonathan Sachs, and Emmanuel Levinas to propose a recovery of humanism with three specific educational consequences. One, pedagogy of the sacred. Two, intelligent spiritualities. And three, pedagogy of difference. There is much to be learned from this entire analysis. I concur with Professor Alexander's concern that extreme positions on the right and the left of the political and religious spectrums have come increasingly to dominate the public square, which challenge peaceful coexistence across difference. Ideological polarization is tearing the fabric of our Western societies, preventing us from agreeing, or at least having critical conversations on basic principles such as the common good, social justice for all, equality, and the affirmation of inalienable rights, among others, that until not long ago, we seemed to assume as possible or desirable in modern democratic life. Our generation witnesses the resurgence of fascism, the anti-religious militancy of secularizing forces threatening religious freedom, among other freedoms, emboldened forms of racism and ethnocentrism, and the shocking tolerance toward hate speech against immigrants, refugees, minorities, and non-conforming populations. A war against the poor and the most vulnerable unfolds before our own eyes with embedded journalists, with up-to-the-minute updates on our screens, with simultaneous commentary on social media as we sit comfortably in our living rooms and offices. At the same time, plutocrats and autocrats feast on what seems unlimited power, testing the limits of our legal and political systems, and increasing their fortunes exponentially while laughing wickedly before everyone else's impotence to stop them. All this in our own democratic societies, many of them grounded and still inspired in so-called Christian and Jewish traditions. Yes, we have educated religiously and academically many of those citizens. Many of them went to our own faith-based schools and faith formation programs. Many of them have read our sacred texts and even our theological and religious education books. As religious educators, theologians, and ministers in our own traditions, we need to engage in some serious soul-searching as well as critical self-assessment to determine how complicit we may be in creating the conditions for some of these dynamics to flourish in our day. One cannot ignore the effects of Christendom, or what Cornel West calls Constantinian Christianity, in shaping the sociocultural and religious imagination of Western societies, to name one example. This is not an indictment on religious education scholars or practitioners, much less a blame game. It is an invitation, however, to assess our pedagogies, sources, and research methods, address weaknesses, make corrections, and embrace innovations as needed. Professor Alexander says, I argue that the time has come to take the public square back from these extremes in diverse democratic societies by offering an alternative account of how we might live together in peaceful coexistence and a concomitant pedagogy to prepare youngsters to do so. My sense is, close quote, my sense is that nearly all of us in this meeting agree with this invitation. The question is how? I would like to suggest two ways forward. First, self-assessment that leads to conversion. As I just suggested, religious education scholars and practitioners need to create spaces for self-critique. It would be naive and rather dishonest to assume that many of the polarizing realities that characterize life in liberal democratic societies in our day emerged in complete isolation from the work that we advance in our own faith communities and our centers of scholarship. Professor Alexander's address compels me to note, for instance, that his insightful analysis is built upon the work of only male voices. Most of such voices are white, European, or North American. With the exception of the scholars who intentionally reflect on difference, the philosophical theories discussed were born in circles that took for granted, and in some cases supported, a socio-political world that thrived in the exclusion of women, racial, ethnic, cultural minorities, and grassroots communities. As we reflect together about difference and peaceful coexistence, I sense a temptation to be too complacent with the idea of dialogue, that dialogue is always possible and even desirable. I also want to be cautious about the enthusiastic embrace of hermeneutical systems concocted in the libraries of France and Germany during the past 2 centuries, or the mostly white Euro-American scholarly circles in North American universities. Perhaps it is time for a good and sustained, let me emphasize sustained, it is time for a good and sustained conversation also with feminist, neocolonial, and Black, Latino, Asian philosophers, scholars of religion, and educators, among others, who have been exploring the question of difference for a long while, from below and from the margins. We need to listen and engage these voices in our analysis. After all, the existence of such groups and the demands they make as they find express their voice with renewed confidence in society, church, and the academy are often the reasons forcing those at the center and with predominant voices to contend with difference, even when they do not want it. Self-assessment leads to conversion. Here, however, I do not speak merely of conversion as changing personal attitudes or commitments. I speak of conversion as structural change. We need to assess what our mission as religious education scholars and what our role needs to be here and now in our societies and in our churches. We do not exist for self-preservation, but to serve larger wholes. The stronger our sense of mission as scholars, the better we understand the society and the communities for which we advance our scholarship, the more relevant our work will be. Second, the religious education scholar as an activist. The circumstances have led many to speak of a crisis in the liberal democratic society, as well as the educational practices and methods we employ to educate the next generations, religiously and non-religiously, call for a fresher type of scholar. I would like to propose the image of the religious education scholar as an activist. Many of us already do activism through our writings and our teaching. Once we put forward our voice, we are doing activism. However, we need more than this, and we need to do it intentionally. The public square, for instance, is being replaced progressively by the virtual square, which tends to be more privatized and reduced to small circles of friends or like-minded respondents. At the same time, increasingly secular societies are forcing us to provide more clarity about who we are and what we contribute to the larger marketplace of ideas. And this all is good. I think that being challenged in this way purifies intentions and clarifies our work. We need religious education scholars who dare to take on the challenges of our contemporary society, the structures of sin that inhibit millions from living a full life, and the misrepresentations of what it means to be human amidst difference. We need our scholarship and our actions to reflect such commitment. Quote, taking back the public square requires a recovery of humanism that is grounded in the fundamental diversity, not uniformity of human experience, and a concomitant innovative pedagogy that prepares students both to embrace the ways in which they are different from others and to engage and respect the ways others may be different from them. Close quote. Professor Alexander concludes. I agree. At the same time, I add that taking back the public square requires creating spaces that intentionally and preferentially affirm the existence of the voices of those whose humanity has been denied and dismissed yesterday and today because of being perceived as different. Doing so will require giving up privilege that is corrosive and oppressive when it exists. Doing so can lead also to the realization that peaceful coexistence may involve elements of conflict and tension as differences refuse to be subsumed into any synthesis or give way to any form of consensus that would render them out of existence. Thank you very much.
It's a great honor and privilege to speak with you. And I just want to say that although we are a team to respond to Dr. Alexander's address, we actually didn't coordinate any of the content. And I'm so inspired by his talk that resonates some of my address and as a response here. I really appreciated Dr. Alexander's deep passion for the public role of education and his urgent plea, which was explicitly stated in the very title of this address, Taking Back the Public Square. I feel a similar urge as we are confronted by violent and divisive relationships across the globe in the post-truth era. Education is a human endeavor. It concerns human knowing, human potential, and freedom. The question of what it means to be human has captivated our educational and philosophical thought throughout millennia. Dr. Alexander, as a philosopher of education, sufficiently and succinctly reviews Western educational thought from pre-modern times all the way to the postmodern era that we find ourselves in today. He articulates the pre-modern view that the aim of education is seeking a good life in a hierarchically ordered manner. In the medieval era, he tells us that the idea of education was to cultivate citizens to flourish by following religious traditions and other authorities. Dr. Alexander stresses that the drastic change experienced in the Enlightenment era, which he, in his words, consisted of a series of political revolutions as far as the human being as knowing subject is concerned. To him, the Enlightenment thought of John Locke, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant could be summarized as having the goal of autonomous individual subjective knowing and having the right to choose ways of life for himself. I intentionally say himself here without being predetermined by religious faith, ethnic affiliation, cultural traditions, or any external authorities. While being critical of Kant and George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, also believed in the liberty of self-defining individuals to ends as history progressed by way of dialectic conversation. I'm kind of summarizing his thought here because I think it's a lot to go through. So then he introduces Jürgen Habermas and John Rawls, early and mid-20th century philosophers who addressed the issues of diversity and distributive justice and a free intersubjective consensus. Dr. Alexander also invites us to closely look at John Dewey and Paulo Freire, whose contributions include, not limited to, but include democratic education and critical pedagogy. In many ways, Dr. Alexander reminds us that the legacy of the European Enlightenment is still felt very strongly today. I was really struck by Dr. Alexander's reference of the Enlightenment ideas as emancipatory. I agree with him. To some extent, one can argue that the Enlightenment was about emancipation. The central idea of the Enlightenment, after all, refers to and aims at achieving individual liberty supported by reason and scientific knowledge. Yes, yet, big yet. I struggle with this very association of the Enlightenment with emancipation because of who these Enlightenment thinkers considered to be knowing subjects or autonomous selves capable of emancipation. Is this emancipation achieved at the cost of enslaving others? I ask this question because these thinkers benefited from the society that was sustained through the hierarchical class system where women served men and the peasant and poor class served the lords and the noble class. And there's no turning back. With the exception of Freire, all the philosophers, and Dr. Hosffman already mentioned, that Dr. Alexander refers is either or completely European or US white males, whether they were born and lived in 4th century BCE or were born in 1920s. It is important to acknowledge this rather obvious fact that most of them as intellectual elites belonged to a privileged group, and their privileges were held at the expense of others. I could not help but agree with the feminist philosopher Eva Kate, who in her work, Love's Labor, quote, "The ideology of equality and emancipation relies on a vision of autonomous individuals who stand outside relations of dependence." But this ideology, as we know, is a myth and an unattainable goal because nobody exists or can survive without depending on others. While these brilliant thinkers were busy writing their thought, others were busy cleaning and cooking for them, so to speak. None are disembodied subjects either, right? One day also rational beings also breathing, sweating, flesh and blood, people with actual bodies. These subjects cannot be only having minds, like having a big brains disproportionately, without having other parts of the body or emotion or souls. Even if the chief Enlightenment philosopher, René Descartes, argued, "I think, therefore I am," he still had his own body upon which he had his thoughts depended. That's why I argued in my own book, modest book, trying to think about a goal of our life as interdependent. And I argue there a notion of a personhood based on freedom, equality, and independence needs deep scrutiny. And here I take on John Locke as an example. And it was funny that Alexander also tackled on him. According to John Locke, he claimed that society is built on a contract. Okay, it's like a deal between free, equal, and independent individuals. But such a claim, I argued or noted, was far from impartial or ideal because during the Enlightenment era, when John Locke claimed that, happened to be coincided with the European colonial era, when these individual freedom, the goal of emancipation, used as a colonial strategy to divide colonized groups and categorized into racial hierarchy. Frantz Fanon, speaking about his own experience of colonialism in Algeria, bluntly expressed it and exposed this very fact in his brilliant work in Wretched of the Earth. I could not help but think there is this incongruence, juxtaposition of what is said. He is independent, and what is actually true. He is not independent. So such an irony is extended to nations. So think about self beyond our own, but as a nation, as a self. Because so-called the global north and global south, where the former is actually while the latter carries the burden of the ecological and economic devastation. That is why post-colonial theorist Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak made a sharp claim, quote, as the North continues ostensibly to aid the South, as formerly imperialism civilized the New World, the South's crucial assistance to the North in keeping up its resource-hungry style is forever foreclosed. In a way, that's why, among all the wonderful philosophers that Dr. Alexander introduced and examined, I appreciated Emmanuel Levinas, especially face to face, one for the other, as an ethical epistemology, which he basically counter-argues that ethics is more a fundamental basis of knowledge than ontology. One self-food, the ontology is anchored in the other. It consists of and flourishes through an unconditionally other-directed relation of responsibility and obligation. Here I am ready to serve. In his vulnerable yet powerful words in Otherwise Than Being, I quote here, the ego is stripped of its scornful and imperialist subjectivity. As I encounter the one for the other, I am decentered, torn off from my beginning in myself. In this encounter, I think there is this theology of the difference, the glory of the otherness interrupts our attempts to cling to sameness. This rupture of sameness is an ethical event conducive to the pedagogy of difference and the pedagogy of the sacred, because the obligation, unconditional obligation to the other, respecting the other's difference, lends itself to the glory of the infinite, the divine, the holy other. This obligation to the other necessitates the pedagogy of difference because, as Dr. Alexander writes, it involves instruction from or about worldviews other than our own. The pedagogy of difference cannot be accomplished without the dialogical pedagogy, whereby all perspectives are open to critical scrutiny, both from within and without, in ways that are appropriate to the educational setting in question, as he contended. So I'll stop here, and if he were right here, I'm going to ask this question. And I think this question is perhaps fruitful for all of us to think through. So Levinas's really philosophy and theology of difference is based on the very notion of how can we decenter ourselves without losing ourselves toward the other. So in that, how can we decenter ourselves without losing ourselves toward the other? So in that big kind of philosophical, almost rhetorical question, these are the two questions I thought we might have some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Both respondents agreed that these two questions that Dr. Kim-Cragg posed are their questions. So I invite you to turn your neighbors again. And so based on what you heard from the paper read by Dr. Silverman, and then two very resonating responses. So think about whether you had a question for Dr. Alexander's paper and then it's answered, or some other thoughts that are provoked by these two responses. And then maybe, we do not have enough time, but maybe we can, you can just share what you shared in your group at the end. But we need to end the session at some point. So we want to hear from you. Things that you want to lift up, things that you want to highlight from your group conversations.
Hello. We were just talking in our group of a teachable moment that we all experienced earlier today that kind of addresses both questions. When Sarah stood up in the midst of us and disagreed with something and gave a full reason why she disagreed with that. And in the back of my mind, I was replaying that scenario in our group. And somebody in the room after she, or while she was speaking, even after she spoke, said, "Shut up." And somebody else stood up and said, "Be quiet." And then two people came over and escorted her, taking her out of the room, if not carrying her out of the room. And while we know that could have happened in a different setting, it did not happen here. That's okay if you were confused. I'm glad you're laughing now. But I hope you get the point of how that scenario, the way it could have played out in the public square, and how it normally plays out in the public square in that way, did not happen here. And what was modeled for us was, I believe, the pedagogy of the sacred, the pedagogy of difference, the pedagogy of hope, because all of us, including myself, I think, learned something from that back and forth and that engagement, that critical reflection, that critical pedagogy that was mentioned in Hanan's speech. So I think that scenario, both as we experienced it and as played out in my mind, addressed both those questions.
Thank you. Any other groups want to highlight, share what you have discussed?
It seems to me that some of the presuppositions aren't being taken into account. And that means that if we're going, the presupposition is that we will have respectful dialogue between two parties. That requires that each party knows themselves, knows their who they are, what they value, what they believe, and then in the knowing of the self, are willing and ready to do the dialogue with the other. But the presupposition is that the very encounter will change who I am. So it will decenter, destabilize, and so the very relationships are totally destabilizing. So it's not too peaceful for the individual, let alone the community, as that kind of destabilizing happens, and then the restabilizing. But it's a dynamic process, and we have to be aware of the psychological effect of the destabilization and the changing of values. And so the respecting one another's difference without losing sight of the power imbalance also needs to, without losing sight of the psychological effects of it. And I'm not, one of the things that I even find, this is the last little bit I didn't share with these people, it's this notion of taking back the public square. That rings bells to me of control and I guess an aggression that I'm not too comfortable with.
Thank you.
Thank you for the responses, and thank you for pointing out some of the voices that were missing in the paper. What I'm struggling with, and it may not be appropriate for this gathering, I'm a newcomer here, so I may be wrong, but I'm struggling with the voices that I hear both in my country, which is Canada, and in other places, where people are not interested in sharing the public square, but in destroying the other. They want to abolish the other. And I'm wondering where, I'm in the job of forming United Church of Canada clergy, and I wonder where I help equip my students to respond respectfully and forcefully, but be aware of the fact that there are other people who don't want to listen, they don't want a dialogue, they don't want to talk, they simply want to eliminate. And it seems to me that the very powerful paper and the responses assume a willingness to have conversation in a society which increasingly, it seems, there's less willingness.
Do you want to respond?
Great reflections and comments. Yeah, I struggle the same thing. Even just between clergy, so just taking not this philosophy, but just a kind of community issue. So clergy or priest or rabbi, that religious authority versus laity, right? So I am speaking as a United Church of Canada person here. One of the sort of theology of the ministry is the theology of the laity, right? Empower the whole people of God. But without losing the important, distinctive role of clergy, right? But it's almost like we're throwing the baby in the water because that's what we want. But so my challenge, I think, hearing you, that students who are being prepared to be the ordained ministers or to be the clergy, having your own voice, your call, knowing that you have that power and privilege, but also there are these forces that want to diminish and eliminate your role as such, as if, so then we go back to that homogeneous or sameness, right? So I think, so that's one response. So I think it's a struggle, but I think we need to be very articulate about what it is that I'm called to serve, if that role is traditionally and historically privileged position. And I'm especially as a I use racialized, but some don't like that word, but people of color, whatever you want, I'm non-white as a woman, right? Claiming clerical position is a power, claiming it, right? I'm taking that claiming, and yet it's multiply located, right? So that's one side. The other side is taking back square story, and I struggle with that too, that kind of aggressiveness and controlling, but I also have to be very blatant about this because of the era where we live, the ultra-right fundamentalists who want to destroy, literally killing people, verbally and actually, in that violent world. I think those of us who are liberal, who are mutually respectful, who want to cultivate very gently, but pursuing this, need to be a little bit more, I would say, prophetic and strongly. And because, like for example, in some of the stories in the United Church, which is very progressive, things we've been done for 30 years, and yet people just don't know. Why? Because we are very shy and we shouldn't be kind of boasting about our work, while the opposite is so vocal against abortion to all kinds of social and ethical issues. So on one hand, we need to be self-examining and aware of our privilege and power, but on the other hand, we need to be mobilizing our prophetic voices of willing to discuss and engage this kind of conversation.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last comment. Or okay.
Sorry, it's the Sabbath, so I'm not using any electronic device.
It's a Sabbath.
I'm trying to speak. Okay, no, it's fine. Two comments or thoughts I'm wondering about in terms of Levinas. The first one is that I doubt that Levinas has a place in his philosophy for the third, meaning for the we. Levinas's philosophy and ethics and ontology is a meaning of the face of the other. So it is his strength, but also his limitation. To rule society, you need laws, you need rules, you need to keep order. Even. I'm not sure we can just transfer Levinas to that. There's another way to say that even to use the word, how do we engage the others as like a kind of thinking exercise is really remote from what Levinas is talking about, which is to go in the spirit of your talk. Is this actually to meet the other, to feel the skin of the other, to smell the smell of the other, the very concrete human being that I'm facing. So that's one, like, just a footnote of like reserve that I had for the way Levinas has been quoted here. And even the first question, that's my second comment, the first question here seems to be, again, pretty remote from Levinas, because it says, without losing sight of power imbalance in this very dialogue. Well, I'm going to say, the appearance of the face of the other for Levinas is imbalanced. It is heteronomous. It does not talk about balancing anything. This sense sounds to me like still a question that is grounded in a Cartesian tradition of the autonomous self that needs someone to be pragmatic and figure out how to balance and imbalance. But I would say the core of Levinas's meaning of the face of the other is precisely to move out of that place by a phenomenology of the appearance of face of the other, which then resonates as a biblical commandment, you shall not kill. And hineni, I'm here for you. So, in other words, it may be that in the spirit of the paper, Levinas has more to bring to the table than the way it has been quoted and used here.
That's a really good concluding remarks. Thank you. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Silverman, and thank you to respondents.